Hi guys, if you're new here, my name is Becca. I'm a writer. I'm currently working on my debut literary fiction novel, and today we're going to talk about plotting and outlining. I know November is a huge month for writers. We're all having our individual writing challenges, some of us partaking in nano, some of us starting brand new challenges, and I think as I'm working on my quote-unquote second book, I don't know if I can technically count it as my second book, but I'm going to. I wanted to share how I plot and outline as someone that was formerly a pantser. My personal approach to writing is actually quite simple. I think that writing should be as unrestricted as possible. And while I see the value definitely in sitting down and thinking through some details, sometimes I feel that we use that process of brainstorming and problem solving as a reason to actually prevent us from getting words down on a page. But I also recognize from my own experience that sometimes jumping headfirst into a project can cause us to write and sometimes write in quote-unquote the wrong direction. And I think there's a happy medium to both of these approaches, and I think there's a medium that allows writers to both enjoy the process of writing while also going into projects with a little bit more planning, a little bit more thoughtfulness. I think being able to create a roadmap for yourself while still giving yourself the space and the creativity to write and explore is really important to have longevity as a writer and make sure that you don't burn yourself out. So we're going to be dividing today's video into 3 sections. We're going to be talking about forming the idea, plotting, and then outline, because I do believe that all 3 of these are really important components to being able to set yourself up for writing success. One last disclaimer before we jump into this video. I just want to acknowledge that everyone has their own way of writing and their own way of getting to the story that they want to tell. And so what works for me might not necessarily work for you, and that is totally okay. This is just something that I'm sharing that has worked for me as someone that thought that they would never ever finish a draft in their life. I managed to finish 2 drafts and decide that that story is actually not the story I want to tell, and there's a different story, and I'm starting on this 3rd draft and I'm almost 20,000 words in. So I want to share a little bit of my experience, and hopefully you can take some tidbits, you know, and embrace some things that work for you, and you can end up creating a writing process that ends up working specifically for you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the first part of this video, which is going to be forming the idea. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be using my current project, which is Project Eden, as an example, as the story that I've plotted and outlined most recently. I first had the idea for this book about 1.5 years ago. I really liked the idea of telling a story about a coming of age for someone much later in life. I feel like coming of age stories are usually centered around teenagers. Teenagers go through a very transformative time in their lives during that age, but I really wanted to explore the idea of someone in their mid to late 20s still not having it figured out, because I feel like so many of us sometimes get to our mid to late 20s and we're like, shouldn't I know what I'm supposed to be doing by now? It can cause so much stress, and so I really wanted to explore that. And I always felt like, you know, that veil of youth and adulthood is just fraught with so many difficulties that sometimes aren't entirely talked about. And so the story sort of marinated for a while until I hit a point in my life where I felt like I really wanted to tell a story. I felt like it was a story that I was looking for in a lot of the books that I was reading. And so I thought, why not write it? It came very naturally to me that my protagonist for this story should be a boy, and that the guide or the B story character should be a woman or a young girl. I wanted to play around with the idea of a woman having a strong sense of self and being able to serve as a guide. Usually in media, you see women as the ones that are in this lost space, and they're trying to figure themselves out either outside of relationships or outside of their careers. And while I do think that's important, I also wanted to subvert that expectation a little bit and subvert that trope and really have a woman know so clearly who she is and what she wants, but what happened to her along the way. And so I knew pretty early on what I wanted the vibe of the book to be. I wanted it to be set on the East Coast. I wanted it to be in autumn. I wanted it to be in the 90s. I wanted to set it during a time where there were no cell phones and no social media, and there was a sense of disconnect that I think a lot of young adults and adults haven't felt in a really long time. And I really liked the idea of exploring individuality in an age that we'll never really have again. We'll never be that disconnected again. And so after I had the general premise of the story, I got to work thinking of ways of making it interesting, which is why I thought about having my female main character be a ghost. And it's also where some people start thinking about tropes where they want to include, what genre the story falls under, etc. I knew I wanted to explore small towns and how that setting kind of impacts someone growing up, and then as an adult, as someone that grew up in a really small town. That's something that always fascinated me, and it's something that I think about constantly. And I think about the effects that had on me growing up and me as an adult now. When it comes to forming the idea and like figuring out all of these details, I think it's really important to start thinking about the kind of story that you want to tell. Is this a journey? Is this a coming of age? Is this magical, whimsical? What do you want the reader to get out of the experience of reading your book? How do you want them to feel as they're reading your book? And I think this is when you start, when you're forming your own ideas, sometimes it can come really easily, and sometimes, it may take a little bit longer to get to the actual heart and root of what it is that you're trying to say. I encourage you to sit down with your ideas, let them marinate, let them stew. As you start sort of dissecting and figuring out and getting your hands into the story that you're hoping to tell, you can kind of start following the threads that arise until you get to the heart of what it is that you're trying to say. And then once you find those big pieces, those big themes that are going to carry your story all the way through to the end, you can start then filling in the gaps of the plot. Now we get to plotting, which is like the first step in a very long journey. And I want to disclaim that sometimes the plot that you start out with can change. The outline that you create for yourself will definitely change. But if you're new to plotting stories, I highly recommend checking out Save the Cat. It's kind of like this industry standard of a 3-act story structure, all of the key beats that need to happen in a story. I kind of always akin this to understanding the wheel of writing, and once you have a good understanding of how that wheel works, you can start to subvert the expectations of the genre in which you're writing, if that's something that you're looking to do. So the thing that I always suggest is to fill out a beat sheet. One thing that I did is I think I made like a spreadsheet of every single Save the Cat beat on one side, and on the right side on like these different columns I left it blank. And so when I was plotting out both my first story and Project Eden, I had specific scenes in mind, obviously, that I was like, okay, this would be really cool to write. I think this is really integral to the story. This sort of thing needs to happen. And the Save the Cat beat sheet really helps you figure out when those things should happen. It's like the first step in figuring out the flow of your story. Now, I encourage you, this might change for you depending on how your writing evolves and how the story evolves, but it's a really great place to start. I think it's just a really good exercise in understanding what you want your story to accomplish and how you want to accomplish it on a bigger scale, right? So these bigger key scenes that you're going to be working towards, because plotting is where you're going to get to the meatier bits of the story. This is why having an understanding of the story that you want to tell is so important. Are you trying to tell a bigger story within a smaller snapshot of a human experience? Are you trying to write in a certain genre because you love that genre and you want to pay homage to that genre? Whatever the why is, hold on to it, because it's going to be your driving force whenever you feel like smashing your head against the keyboard and whenever you feel like your writing is stupid and not good enough. But plotting is the fun bit before you get to the more technical stuff of outlining. So I really encourage you to just take your time with it. Figure out what you want your story to look like, because this is where you're gonna, once you have all of that figured out, then you're gonna start outlining. So now that you have your key beats, you have an idea of your characters and who they are and what their wants are, it's time to figure out how all of that is going to get woven together. And I think it's important, again, I will reiterate this every single chance that I can, things will change. Go into the outlining process with an incredibly open mind, not just as you're writing the outline, but also as you're also drafting as well. Because you may expect your characters to act one way, and once you get into the nitty-gritty of actually writing out their scenes and their dialogue and how they interact with other people, you may discover new things about them, and the actions that you anticipated them doing to help move the story along might actually change. And so you kind of have to take a pause, and you don't want to get too solidified in your outline, because these things will happen and these things are going to change, or you might think of something that no longer makes sense, or some way of like introducing a piece of information that's better than what you had, and that changes like XYZ down the line. So I know that once I had my characters and I wrote down what lessons I wanted my main character to learn, and I started figuring out what his arc would look like, I started writing down everything that I could for my secondary characters and how my main character would interact with those individuals. Getting an understanding of this is going to help you understand how your characters, again, move through the story, how their actions are going to make sense. And then when you write a scene and you realize actually Peter would never say this and Laurel would never act like this, it helps you kind of pivot, and it helps you get a real sense of ownership over the story and the voices and the characters that you're putting on a page, which just goes that much further into solidifying them as real fleshed out characters and not just vessels for a trope. You know what I mean? I'm also going to say something controversial. Well, I don't feel like it's controversial, but I've heard conflicting messaging on this, and I recommend that you write everything down. Pick a place, whether it's digital or a notebook. I prefer handwriting things. I feel like it's better for me. It helps solidify it in my brain a lot better. But I was watching an old interview from Stephen King, and he said that using notebooks and writing things down was basically like keeping a graveyard of shitty ideas. But I tend to disagree with him, and I don't think that that's a take that's very inclusive of people that are neurodivergent and have a really hard time remembering things or keeping track of things. And I can't tell you how many times I've sat in my bed late at night thinking through my story, thinking through a plot hole that I've encountered, and I figure out how to solve it, and believe it or not, I forget by the morning because I don't write it down how I want to fix it. And it's so frustrating. So if you struggle with remembering things, if you're neurodivergent and you have ADHD, I really encourage you to write things down the moment you think of them. Even if you don't end up using it, just do yourself the favor and write it down anyway. When it comes to actually building your outline, I encourage you to try out different things. I have a Notion template that I use for my writing projects, and I keep my outline in there. Basically, I will have 2 columns: what chapter I'm working on, how many words it is, if it's completed, and then 1 to 2 sentence summary of what that chapter needs to accomplish. I will also include, this is kind of like a modified Save the Cat beat sheet that I mentioned earlier. I will include what beat of the Save the Cat that chapter should be aiming to hit. So if I have my opening image or my debate or my break into 2, I have a really clear understanding of how that chapter is supposed to satisfy that beat. I think it's a really great way for when I go back and revise to go back and double check if what I've written adequately fits the beat that it's trying to accomplish. I know some people that use Google Sheets. I know some people that write it out by hand. I mean, I've seen so many different ways of outlining, and it doesn't need to be complicated. I think doing a chapter by chapter outline is going to help you so much to not feel the fear of a blank page once you get to actually drafting and you're supposed to start a chapter and you're like, I actually don't know what I want to do here. I admit it takes some time. I think it took me all in all like 2 days to do a full plot outline for Project Eden, but it is so helpful to have. And it just, I feel like, you know, working up the nerve to sit down and write is already so, it feels so overwhelming. And to then sit down and think of, oh God, what am I gonna write? It just adds another layer of like frustration and doubt. And I don't want you to have to go through that. Put in the extra effort, put together a rough outline. This will also give you an idea of how long your book is gonna be. I got this from Victoria Aviard, but if you do that outline and you have an understanding of roughly how long your chapters typically are, for instance, mine is usually either 2.5 or 2.5K to 2.7K words. So for Project Eden with 23 chapters, I think I outlined, that puts me at around 6,100 words, 6,200 words. And so it gives you a sense of like, okay, this is where I'm gonna end up. And then once you're done, you can figure out where you want to add, where you want to subtract. Is there a chapter that's uncharacteristically longer than another chapter or than every other chapter that you have? So it gives you a really good snapshot of visually what your book is going to look like. And I personally like using Notion because if I need to move where a chapter is occurring, I can literally just take the row of cells and move them in the table that I've created, and it's so much easier than having to delete everything and paste it into a new cell and start from scratch. So it's just find what works for you. If you like mind mapping, like there's literally so many ways of doing it, and I encourage you to experiment and figure out what way is going to be best for you. I hope these tips help all of you get a better footing on how to tackle your books and your stories and finally motivate you to start writing. I love writing. I love encouraging people to write. I think it's such a wonderful exercise in empathy and exploration and embracing your own creativity. So if you liked this video, if you liked me, please consider subscribing. I post new videos every Saturday at 10 a.m. and in the month of November, I'm posting bonus videos on Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Please consider subscribing and liking this video if this was really helpful for you. And if you made it all the way to the end, consider dropping a notebook emoji because I know you're going to start outlining your books in the month of November. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!